Hey everyone, today we're diving into a wild, almost unbelievable story out of Rhode Island, something that makes you question how people with power think they can act in public. It all starts on the evening of August 14th at the Clark Cookhouse in Newport, Rhode Island. Now, for those who don't know, Newport is a town that oozes class and elegance. This isn't your average Friday night hangout spot. The Clark Cookhouse is the kind of place where jackets are practically mandatory and where every table seems to have an air of sophistication. They have a couple of dining options: the porch, which is their fancy sit-down experience, and the bistro, which is a slightly more relaxed, but still upscale option. In other words, this is not the kind of place where you expect a public spectacle. People go there to enjoy their food, have conversations, and soak in the atmosphere, not to witness someone completely losing control. But on that August evening, the calm and composed world of Newport dining was about to be shattered. A woman and her friend were caught on camera outside the restaurant, acting in a way that was shocking to diners, staff, and even random pedestrians walking by. According to witnesses, the two women were behaving aggressively and refusing to comply with staff instructions, forcing the restaurant to call the police. This wasn't a subtle disagreement or a minor disturbance. This was full-blown chaos that spilled out into public view. From the very first moments of the incident, it was clear that these women had no intention of following standard procedures. They were loud, confrontational, and seemingly intent on asserting authority that they didn't have. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was a clash between regular citizens trying to enforce rules and two women who seemed to believe that the rules simply didn't apply to them. Staff at the restaurant, realizing that the situation was escalating and that it could potentially become dangerous, made the call to the police to have the women officially trespassed. In other words, they were asking law enforcement to remove these individuals from the property immediately because they were disrupting business and refusing to leave when politely asked. Now, this is where the story becomes even more absurd. When the officers arrived on the scene, they were met with defiance and confusion. The women didn't just quietly leave. They attempted to negotiate, argue, and even instruct the officers on what they were supposed to do, citing various claims of legal knowledge and authority. Imagine this: two women standing outside a high-end restaurant, trying to leverage some kind of imagined power to resist the law. It's almost cinematic in its audacity, yet completely real. Witnesses describe the scene as chaotic. People dining just a few feet away were watching in disbelief as arguments escalated. Pedestrians passing by could hear the shouting, the protests, and the repeated demands to turn off the body cam, which the women insisted was required by law. The police officers, trained to handle confrontations, had to manage not just the two women, but also onlookers who were trying to make sense of what was unfolding. At this point, it was clear that the women weren't just acting out. They were attempting to assert influence and intimidate law enforcement. As the situation unfolded outside the Clark Cookhouse, the confrontation between the women and law enforcement quickly escalated. When the officers first arrived, their goal was simple: enforce the trespass order and restore order. But the women refused to comply, insisting that they had rights and authority far beyond what any normal citizen would possess. One of the women even claimed that she was an attorney, or more specifically, a member of the Attorney General's office. She argued repeatedly that her position gave her some sort of immunity, that she was entitled to dictate how the police handled the situation, and that the officers were legally obligated to comply with her demands. Witnesses described it as a surreal scene. Normally, when someone is told by the police that they must leave private property, they comply. Not this time. Instead, the women debated the officers, questioned their authority, and repeatedly insisted on explanations for every instruction. One officer calmly tried to clarify, explaining that the women were being trespassed and needed to leave. The women countered with claims about protocol, body cam regulations, and legal technicalities, turning a straightforward situation into a drawn-out standoff. At one point, the argument reached a nearly absurd level. The women demanded that the officers turn off their body cameras. They insisted that it was standard protocol, that the officers had no choice but to comply. The officers, however, knew better. Body cameras are controlled at the discretion of law enforcement, not at the whim of someone claiming to be a lawyer. Despite repeated explanations, the women persisted, clearly believing that their supposed government positions would allow them to override the law. Meanwhile, tensions escalated with every passing moment. One of the women's companions, apparently her husband, tried to mediate, but he was largely powerless against the escalating chaos. The women shouted, gestured, and argued their way into a frenzy, while the officers stayed professional, attempting to de-escalate without resorting to force. The scene drew attention from diners, staff, and passersby who could hardly believe what they were witnessing. Two fully grown adults, mothers, were creating an uproar in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, seemingly convinced that their professional titles and connections rendered them untouchable. Eventually, the officers began the process of physically removing the women from the property, as their refusal to leave had turned the situation from a verbal disagreement into an actionable trespass. At this point, one of the women claimed she was an AG, or Assistant Attorney General, and tried to assert that her badge and position offered her protection. She repeatedly questioned the officers, asking if she was under arrest, whether she needed to be handcuffed, and even whether she could be detained for failing to comply. The irony was palpable. She was attempting to use the law she had sworn to uphold to exempt herself from the consequences of breaking it. Despite her claims, the officers proceeded according to protocol. The women were eventually handcuffed and detained, but not before a dramatic series of exchanges that highlighted their arrogance and disbelief that anyone would treat them like ordinary citizens. Onlookers watched as the officers carefully guided the women to comply, trying to maintain calm while dealing with constant interruptions, arguments, and irrational demands. Observers noted the absurdity of it all. The women's behavior, yelling, arguing, and insisting on special treatment, stood in stark contrast to the calm professionalism of the police officers. People watching couldn't help but notice the stark difference between the women's sense of entitlement and the reality of law enforcement procedure. This wasn't just a story of a public tantrum. It was a case study in the dangers of abusing perceived power. By the end of the night, the incident had made headlines, not just for the chaos outside the Clark cookhouse, but for who the women were. One of them, the self-proclaimed Attorney General representative, was identified as Devin Flanagan, a Special Assistant Attorney General with 7 years of experience. The other, her friend Veronica Hannon, was a corporate professional. Their positions and the audacity of their actions transformed what could have been a minor trespassing case into a story that captured statewide attention. But this wasn't just about titles or jobs. It was about accountability. The officers had demonstrated that no position, no badge, no amount of perceived authority could place someone above the law. And as the night drew to a close, the reality sank in. These women, despite their high-powered jobs and assumed legal expertise, had been thoroughly shut down by the very system they claimed to understand and control. The morning after the chaotic night outside the Clark cookhouse, the situation had already begun to spiral into a full-blown public scandal. News of the incident quickly spread. not just as a story about a restaurant confrontation, but because of who the participants were. Devin Flanagan, the self-proclaimed Attorney General, had miscalculated spectacularly. What she likely imagined as a minor confrontation she could manipulate using her position became a statewide spectacle of entitlement, arrogance, and outright lawbreaking. The very next day, Flanagan's boss, Rhode Island Attorney General Peter Narina, personally summoned her to his office. He reportedly made her watch the full police body cam footage, an uncomfortable and likely humiliating experience. While we didn't get the full private meeting, the public statements that followed gave a clear picture of his reaction. Narina described the behavior as inexcusable, embarrassing, and humiliating, not just for Flanagan, but for the entire Attorney General's office. He acknowledged that while managing a large team of over 100 lawyers comes with challenges, he had rarely seen actions as reckless and damaging as this. He described it as a situation that required careful thought before determining any official sanction, but he made it clear that a strong consequence was inevitable. According to reports, Narina attributed much of the incident to alcohol. While Flanagan had not been driving, her impaired judgment from drinking led her to make a series of poor decisions, refusing to leave when ordered, attempting to weaponize her job to intimidate officers, and creating a public spectacle in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. Narina highlighted that even though she held a junior position in the Attorney General's office, the expectation was that she understood the law and exercised good judgment at all times. Instead, she had done the opposite, using her position to try to escape accountability. Meanwhile, the public was left to process the surreal nature of the incident. Onlookers described the women's behavior as over-the-top, almost comical at times, but also deeply disturbing. Devin Flanagan, despite her supposed legal expertise, had acted as if she were above the law. She repeatedly demanded that police officers turn off their body cameras, insisted that her badge gave her immunity, and argued constantly with the officers while ordinary citizens watched in disbelief. Her friend, Veronica Hannon, was caught in the chaos as well, appearing stunned and unsure how to respond when the officers made it clear that titles and connections did not matter in this situation. By August 21st, just a week after the incident, WPRI, a local news outlet, reported that Flanagan had been placed on unpaid leave while the Attorney General's office conducted a full investigation into her conduct. This suspension reflected the severity of her actions, sending a clear message that misuse of authority, even by someone within the system, would not be tolerated. Veronica Hannon faced consequences as well. She was charged with resisting arrest, largely due to her attempts to evade handcuffs and her physical resistance as officers tried to secure the scene. The legal process moved quickly. By August 27th, Flanagan was arraigned in court. She entered a plea of no contest to the trespassing charge. While this did not constitute an admission of guilt in the traditional sense, it allowed her to accept responsibility for the evidence against her without prolonging the trial. The court also ordered that she could not enter the Clark Cookhouse for 6 months and required her to pay the associated court costs. Hannon also pled no contest to resisting arrest, cementing the consequences for both women. For Flanagan, the repercussions went beyond the courtroom. Her actions had publicly undermined her credibility as a member of the Attorney General's office. What might have been a minor trespass case became a cautionary tale of arrogance, entitlement, and the consequences of misusing a government position. Her suspension, coupled with the public scrutiny, served as a reminder that positions of power come with responsibilities, and that attempting to evade accountability will almost always backfire. In the court of public opinion, the incident became a viral story, with viewers and readers alike marveling at the audacity and tone-deaf behavior of someone in her position. Commentators highlighted the irony. A lawyer trained to uphold the law attempted to manipulate it for personal gain, only to be held accountable in the most public way possible. The incident also sparked discussions about privilege, the misuse of authority, and the importance of accountability for public officials. In the end, the Clark Cookhouse incident stands as a vivid example of what can go wrong when personal arrogance meets professional entitlement. Devin Flanagan's brief lapse in judgment resulted in legal consequences, professional embarrassment, and a lasting reputation as the Attorney General who thought she was above the law. Meanwhile, her friend and companions, caught in the whirlwind of her behavior, also faced legal repercussions. This story, dramatic and somewhat absurd, also carries a lesson. No matter your position or power, the law applies to everyone, and attempts to evade it rarely succeed. Once the news of Devin Flanagan and her friend Veronica Hannon's confrontation at the Clark Cookhouse hit the media, the public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media lit up with posts, tweets, and memes mocking the audacity of a supposed attorney general abusing her position in such a public and ridiculous manner. People were captivated not only by the chaotic events outside the restaurant, but also by the irony. A junior member of the Attorney General's office, trained to enforce the law and uphold justice, found herself on the wrong side of it in a very public spectacle. Many commentators pointed out the sheer absurdity of the situation. Flanagan had attempted to assert her government position to intimidate police officers, claiming that her badge and title provided her immunity. The footage of her arguing with law enforcement, insisting that body cameras be turned off, and repeatedly defying direct orders became a viral sensation. Viewers around the country, and even beyond Rhode Island, were stunned by the level of entitlement on display. For many, it was almost surreal to watch someone in a role meant to protect and enforce the law actively flout it in real time. Veronica Hannon, Flanagan's friend, became a secondary figure in the story, but was no less noteworthy. She appeared visibly confused and overwhelmed as the officers refused to acknowledge the supposed special status that Flanagan tried to wield. Social media users sympathized with her in some ways, noting that she seemed dragged into the chaos simply by being associated with Flanagan. Yet, her resistance to arrest, even if minor, led to her own legal consequences, demonstrating that the law treats everyone equally regardless of friendship or status. The public debate quickly extended beyond the specific events of the night. Commentators questioned the culture of entitlement in government positions, particularly when junior officials believe their titles exempt them from accountability. This incident became a case study in what can happen when arrogance, poor judgment, and alcohol combine with the misuse of authority. Discussions emerged about training, oversight, and the need for public officials to understand that their role is to serve citizens, not themselves. News outlets highlighted statements from Rhode Island Attorney General Peter Narina, who had publicly addressed Flanagan's behavior. He described her actions as inexcusable and embarrassing, noting that they reflected poorly on the entire office. While he was careful to point out that a thorough investigation would follow, his statements reinforced the principle that no one, regardless of position, is above the law. Narina's handling of the situation was praised by some commentators for showing accountability and leadership, especially in a case where public trust was at stake. Meanwhile, the legal resolution of the case underscored the consequences of acting without regard for the law. Flanagan's no contest plea to trespassing resulted in a 6-month ban from the Clark Cookhouse and the requirement to pay court costs. Hannon's no contest plea to resisting arrest confirmed that actions taken in the heat of the moment, even when influenced by someone else, carry consequences. For many viewers, this was a reassuring reminder that accountability is not optional, even for those in positions of power. Beyond the immediate legal consequences, the story carried broader lessons about ethics, responsibility, and public perception. Flanagan's attempt to leverage her government role to avoid consequences backfired spectacularly, leading to public ridicule and professional embarrassment. Her actions highlighted the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of humility, especially for those entrusted with public authority. For the general audience, it was a vivid example of how entitlement and poor judgment can escalate ordinary situations into major scandals. The Clark Cookhouse incident also sparked conversations about societal expectations of public officials. Many argued that anyone holding a government position should understand that their behavior, both public and private, reflects on the office they serve. Misusing power for personal gain, as Flanagan attempted, not only harms individuals involved, but erodes trust in institutions meant to uphold justice. Social media commentary often underscored the point with humor, memes, and sharp critiques, ensuring that the story stayed in the public eye long after the initial confrontation.